Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with
Our
me.
May 2013 edition of Brethren Voices featured annual conference moderator Bob Krause of the Little Swatara Church of the Brethren in Pennsylvania. We asked Bob what he does for fun, and Bob talked about his love of sailing and that he has had several sailboats. Having spent time as a missionary, Bob went on to share some of his thoughts about retirement and goals that he hopes to be able to do someday.
I look forward to the day when we'll start planting churches in Cuba. And I think it would be great to sail down into that area and live aboard the boat, kind of combine a personal pleasure with a passion that I have to continue serving God in some sort of mission in the developing world.
Today's guests are brethren from Portland, Oregon, Doug and Jan Eller. They are both recently retired and just returned from a visit to Cuba with the organization Road Scholar. Jan and Doug, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cuba is the country that Bob Krause discussed, hoping to someday establish Brethren congregations there. According to historical records, when Christopher Columbus came to the Americas in 1492, he first landed on a little island, October 12th. And then he landed on a big island, which we now call Cuba, on October 28th. Today, Cuba has a population of over 11 million. They gained their independence from Spain in 1902 and became a democracy. And then they lost their democracy in 1952 when Fulgencio Batista lost the presidential election and staged a coup, overtaking the country in March 1952. He was a virtual dictator until 1959. Under his rule, the rich and the middle class prospered, but the poor suffered. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara headed a revolution supported by the Soviet Union, which ousted Batista and formed the present state on January 1st, 1959. Doug and Jan, I understand that planes fly every day from Miami to Cuba, but most Americans are not permitted to visit. But you were. Can you tell us why Americans are not permitted to visit Cuba?
The obvious reason is because it's a communist country. And because of the relationship with the Cuban exiles and our government with the embargo of Cuba, they do not allow travel. People have always gotten in through Canada. But a couple of years ago, President Obama opened up the licenses for cultural exchanges. And so when I was reading through one of the catalogs of groups we've traveled with, here is trips to Cuba. And so we were able to go on, called people-to-people cultural exchanges. And that is a primary way that most Americans can get through to Cuba.
So as a normal American, I couldn't just go to Cuba from Miami, but if I went to Canada, I could.
Or Cancun,
Okay.
go over from Cancun, and they know not to stamp your visa so that you can get back into the U.S.
So it's the Americans that don't want you to go.
Right.
Oh, okay.
And that's what Obama has signed saying you can. So
If you do go through a cultural exchange program.
yes,
Yes.
the tour group we were with runs 20 trips a month
Oh my.
To Cuba.
into Cuba.
Wow.
So
And then-
Americans are very, very, very interested in touring and seeing what the country's like.
Wonderful. And you found the Road Scholar program through the internet?
Road Scholar used to be Elder Hostel.
Okay.
And so a lot of people are familiar with Elder Hostel, and they've changed their names in the last couple of years. And we had been on a couple of tours with Road Scholar. So I just get their catalogs and always look through it to see where else we might go.
And Cuba was part of that portfolio.
They do 3 different tours of varying emphases.
So how long did you go for, and how big was the group?
We had 24 in our group, and we were there for 9 days.
We stayed in a hotel in Havana, Hotel Nacional, which is a very historical hotel, and then we stayed in a nice hotel in Cienfuegos, which was our last city stop.
When I was doing a little research on Cuba, it seemed like the politics was really interesting to me, about being a democracy and then being dictatorship and being a socialist state originally. Were you able to learn more about that while you were there? Was that on the minds of the Cubans? Did they want to tell their story about the politics of their country?
I don't know that our tour guide, we had a Cuban tour guide in addition to actually our other tour guide was Italian, but our Cuban tour guide spent a lot of time in our bus, because we rode buses everywhere, telling us a lot of different information. I really don't know how freely most Cubans would be able to talk about. They talk about their life and how it affects them, but not about the politics. I mean, they don't really have a choice, and it's becoming more open, but they still don't really have a choice in their government.
Now, I'm going to ask a question which maybe people know the answer to, but I don't. Is Fidel Castro still alive, and is he still a key player in the political scene?
Fidel is alive, and he is not a key player anymore. Really, his brother Raul is kind of taken over the leadership for the Communist Party. And the Communist Party runs the country. But the people of the country aren't necessarily communist. It's a kind of a strange thing. And the country, it feels like the country is living the revolution. And what it basically boils down to is people in Cuba, a majority of people in Cuba suffer they suffered under Batista. They've suffered under communism. So they are resilient people, and I don't think it matters what government structure comes in. They're going to be Cubans first, I think, in some senses.
I was very surprised in reading about the present population that they're primarily white, with about a 25% mulatto or mestizos, and then about 10% black. But what happened to the original native people of Cuba?
They all got killed off, either by the Spanish or by disease. So the indigenous Indians of Cuba are gone.
Are gone, okay.
Which happens in a lot of the Caribbean, where conquest happens.
And just to kind of complete the story, there's a lot of Cuban Americans living in Miami and in Florida, and that resulted from something that happened later. It was significantly after the revolution. So, did you find out about that? And those are the people who are going back and visiting Cuba every day, because now they can travel back and forth from Miami to Cuba. But the Cubans can't come to America, but the Cuban Americans can go to Cuba, as I understand. Do you know how did we get such a population of Cuban Americans in Miami?
The first round of the Cuban Americans were the ones that left in *59 after the revolution. And I think they fully intended to go back, but the revolution continued, and then soon, in a few years, the Soviets came in. So then they were not able to go back, and their property was confiscated. So most of those people are probably middle-aged and elderly by now. The second wave of people was around 1980, and it's called the Mariel Boat Lift, is what we know it by. And even on the West Coast, I remember hearing about that. And that was where a lot of people started to leave, and Fidel said, well, of course they can leave. And so then he opened the prison doors and the mental institutions and put all these people on the boat, and I don't remember how many thousands of people left and flooded into Florida. The policy is, if you can get your foot on the ground, then you can stay in America.
And today, any Cuban from Cuba that sets foot on the United States,
on the United States soil,
yes,
is free to be here. No immigration. They can live here, I think it's a year without filling any documents out. They don't have to, we welcome them with open arms. That's been the policy. And the relationship between Cuba and the United States is governed and dictated by the Miami Cubans. Miami Cubans are the ones who have the power in Congress to keep the embargo or blockade, depending on your point of view. So they have the political clout to have the relationship. And so now, in some senses, since the Soviet Union has pulled out, tourism is now becoming the industry to try and because everybody wants to go to Cuba. We saw many tour buses. So that's a way for the people to try and make an income and try to survive there in a really tough economy.
From what you're saying, we're in a great debate about immigration right now, but mostly from Mexico. But there's totally different rules that apply
Yes.
to Cubans coming to America.
Yes.
There's no wall, there's no fence. If they can get here by swimming or floating or canoeing, they can be here as long as they put their foot on the soil.
1 foot on the soil. If you don't get the foot, then send you back. But if you get the
Right.
foot on the soil.
And
if
then,
yeah.
if they've been here a year and a day, they are eligible for citizenship in the U.S.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Immediately,
Really?
Yeah.
yes.
Oh my, oh my.
We're going to
Very
show
different.
we're going to show the communist, and that's how we do it.
Okay. What kind of things did you see and what kind of things did you do in Cuba?
A lot of what we did was dictated by the Cuban government. They want to show you all these things to show how normal life is as much as possible. We visited homes. We visited upper class, middle class, and a lower class home, met with the people. We visited a senior center who showed us their activities and their crafts. We went to a Jewish synagogue in one of the cities. We went all over Havana. They wanted to show us all the public squares and a lot of the places. Went to Hemingway's home on the outskirts of Havana.
Art museums,
Yeah.
Schools.
Oh yes, the
Went
school.
to schools, got a little taste of what the school system's like there. And,
You flew from Miami to Havana on an airlines that I'd never heard before, like World Travel or
But
something.
it was related to American Airlines.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
and then what the first thing you notice is how many TVs and things are getting loaded on the
yeah.
plane. People in the plane, men with 3 or 4 hats. So anything they can get into the country, they take in, because they don't have stuff in Cuba.
So these are, again, these are Cuban Americans were on this flight along with your
Yes.
tour group, and they're taking things for friends and relatives
Yes,
in Cuba.
yes.
Or
Okay.
sending things to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where do most of the goods come from that are for sale in Cuba?
Well, there's not much for sale. Not that we could tell. And I think some of the stuff is coming from China. But you have to look at the economy. So I don't know what the average wage would be, but I can tell you that an electrician would make about $12 a month.
A month?
So the
12 U.S. dollars.
$12 a month. So the economy, the whole economy, is in such a low. It's kind of like an isolated country, and so they have to try and do everything they can internally, just because of the fact that the wages are so low. Now you can say the wages are real low. There's nobody. You can be a doctor, go to school. You can go to school free, become a doctor, but then a doctor will turn around and buy a restaurant, and run a restaurant because they can make more money doing a restaurant than they can being a government doctor. The stores, most of the stores are government stores, and there are ration stores. Everybody's entitled to a certain amount of rice and a certain amount of sugar and a certain amount of coffee.
Do they have to pay for those things? I mean, if you have a ration card, do you go and you buy it, or do you just...
I don't think you do for the ration.
I don't think you
at
do
the
in the ration store.
Okay.
But then the other stores you go in, they're very, very, there's not much on the shelves. of things, and they don't have the money to buy
buy
it.
it.
That's why tourism is a big thing there now, because when the Russians pulled out, they had no support. Venezuela has been the one who has been supportive of them, and now that's a question on what will happen in the future politics with that country.
The other thing to know is that there are two currencies in Cuba. You cannot use anything but their currencies. We had access to the dollar, Cuban dollar, and they most of the time have access to a Cuban peso. And the Cuban dollar is worth $25 more, 25 times what the Cuban peso is worth. So if you're paid in pesos only from the state, then it's very hard for you to buy things unless you have income coming in. But if you and Raul has opened up so that people can actually be self-employed. There are taxi drivers for tourists. There are some restaurants, some bed and breakfasts, and they have certain rules, but they can get money in the Cuban dollar that then they have more access to buying power.
So did you find people wanting to get the dollars, willing to do things for you or asking you for money? Was there begging as there is in many third world countries?
In Havana, if you went away from the tour group, it wasn't hard to find people begging, wanting something. And I did not see that in smaller towns, but I remember seeing it in Havana, at a bookseller's, people begging. Not quite as much as we see here in Portland on the streets every time you drive, but still there. And people are just poor. As an example, a lot of the places you go, the public places, museums, the schools we went in, none of the toilets had toilet seats.
Oh, really?
They can't afford them. Paint and supplies, the infrastructure deteriorating because they can't afford to pay U.S. prices for goods and services. So they're kind of lost in a time warp in terms of playing on the international scene.
Can you kind of compare the homes you visited with the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class? What was the difference in terms of just the home size and what was the furnishings and things like that? And maybe the people, if you could.
Well, the upper class home we went to was in Trinidad, which is one of the cities in the southeastern part of the island. That was like a whole block. Used to be a family home and cigar factory. So they were quite wealthy at one time. And then the cigar factory left, and some of the relatives didn't want to maintain the home, so they partitioned the home, and he runs a part of it as a bed and breakfast. So the man and his sister now run this home, and we were able to look in the rooms. And they had lots of nice china around and pictures on the wall, things they were able to buy there, so obviously they were getting money. That was the nicest home. The poorest one we went to.
No paint, falling apart, exposed wiring.
No toilet tank.
No
have to
toilet
use a
tank.
bucket.
You would go outside and get water to flush your toilet. The shower, they had a shower in it, but there was no shower head, just the pipe coming down. And very, very, very meager furniture, picture of grandkid on the wall, that kind of thing. And it's a woman who has to live off of the pension, the government pension. And she has her son living with her, who is a fisherman, fishes for the government. And by the way, most of the fish that apparently is caught goes to the tourists. Tourists get stuff that regular people don't.
Did the people in the three homes, did they talk about their lives and they talk about their families and the children and things like that?
Not as much about their families. More about the housing, the housing situation. Ownership of houses is very complicated, and so there was some trying to figure out that, as well as the educational system. So they didn't talk as much personally, but more about the home and how they lived.
Once you buy your home, and you can afford to buy your home.
That's two different things. So once you can afford it, and then if you find one
if you find when you buy it, but then you own it and you don't pay, there are no taxes. So you own it, and sometimes you own other people's homes, the people who moved to Miami, so they want the homes back. That's always a thing. What surprised me, I think, the most when I think about Cuba is that it's always a difference between the haves and have-nots. And when that became so great during Batista's time, then it allowed people like Castro and Guevara to want to change that. And then in their change to help people, then they get mired up in our dirty politics with the Bay of Pigs and get mired up. And then pretty soon it's the haves and the have-nots again. Not so much difference there that used to be, but it's always the same struggle that people overthrow, and then things are going well for a while, and then it's the haves and have-nots.
One of the things I noticed and I've heard about are the old cars.
Oh, yes.
Okay, tell us about the old cars.
Oh, we just love them. We get off the plane, we'll go, oh, look at that, look at that, look at that. And after a while, our tour guide said, I'm trying to tell you about stuff, and all you're doing is looking at the old cars. He said, we hate these old cars because they don't have an American parts. So they had to scrap everything together to fix these cars with Soviet parts. So they got Soviet engines, diesel engines, smelly, stinky cars, and the Cubans just hate them.
But they're amazing. I mean, they're almost museum pieces.
Some of them.
What I saw.
Some of them are, and they're all taxis. That's what they do. It's a taxi thing. Interesting to me is
And these are cars from what, the 50s?
These are
50s, early 60s
Yeah,
even.
yeah. I think there would be a real market for those cars. That would be something they could export.
You bet.
But you know, Chevrolet had dealerships in Cuba. So back in the day, when we were in love with Cuba and supported the dictator. Yeah.
What about spirituality and religion in Cuba? You mentioned going to synagogue. Did you get to visit a church?
Not a Christian church, no. The closest we came to seeing anything about the religion of Cuba was going to a Santeria museum. Santeria is what they would call Afro-Cuban, which means that when the slaves came over from Africa, they brought a lot of their religious background, their saints, you know, the animal sacrifices, the kinds of things they did. In Cuba, then, during the Spanish, they put a Catholic veneer on it by adopting some of the Catholic saints for some of the Santeria, you know, the basic religion there. So I think they said something like 90% of the people would adhere to something like Santeria. That includes voodoo would be another. Santeria and voodoo are not the same, but voodoo and all those kinds of earth-based religions would be more popular than Catholicism or Pentecostalism or anything that we know.
So Santeria kind of sounds Catholic, but it's not really Christian at all.
That's right.
It's more spirit or earth spirit based. And you said about 90% of the people would probably say that's where they get their spirituality?
If they have any at all, yeah.
Okay.
It does not seem to be a very churched place.
Well,
I'm trying to remember statistics on it, but I was not impressed.
the same thing happened in communist Russia, where
Yes.
just virtually practicing Christianity was gone, but there was still a underground of the faithful in terms of Orthodox and Catholic, but that's reemerging.
But there were quite a few Catholic charities. Sisters of Charity were running a leprosarium that we were at. The Jewish community, they were supported by B'nai B'rith, which is an international Jewish organization. And they were so proud. They had just gotten the Torah. So they showed us their Torah, their little cabinet, and talked about, there's not very many Jews in Cuba, but they have been quite active in terms of being with tour groups.
Talking about the haves and the have-nots, New Community Project has gone into many places to help us in America understand what the third world is like and how our politics is affecting them. And it sounds like American politics and the embargo is still a very major concern and impediment to the development of Cuba's economy.
Yes, they call it a blockade. We call it an embargo. They call it a blockade because most of our allies will not. We'll fine them big time if they
Oh,
send.
really?
Oh, yes.
So we're actively
So we are
promoting this.
actively promoting it. They get, of course, they were getting their oil from Venezuela and other goods. China is the next major producer. Russia, not so much anymore. But Spain and Italy are about the only two European countries that we heard of that had anything at all coming in. So in a sense, it really is a blockade.
Okay.
So it's political. I mean, it's still political because the Miami Cubans, they don't want to recognize Fidel or that as a legitimate government, and so we're backing that up. If we lifted the blockade today, I don't think it would make a whole lot of difference right away because they would be able to get stuff, but they couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
So still, it's that low economic position that they're in.
When you talk about all of these things, it's really, to me, sad that the persecuted become the persecutors. Even in this Miami Cuban American group, I mean, they're wanting to have the embargo to make the country fail, the government fail, so they can take over. But as a result of that, the people are suffering, and it's part of it becomes a persecution, an economic persecution of the poor people, and they suffer the most from the people who want to liberate Cuba.
Yeah.
It's a funny paradox situation to me. Doug and Jan Eller, thank you for being with us on Brethren Voices and sharing your experiences and your pictures of Cuba.
Well, thanks, Brent, for having us. We hope other people, other brethren, will take the plunge and go to Cuba to see what it's like and see our brothers and sisters down there.
It was an experience, quite an experience, and we're really glad to share it with everybody so that they have a better idea of what's going on.
That's wonderful, because I don't think we do. We just really don't know. And I'm very happy that people like Bob Krause have an idea and a mission and a goal of bringing the Church of the Brethren to Cuba if they can. For Brethren Voices, this is Brent Carlson, wishing you peace.
Shall be called the friends of God. May His peace begin with me. Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When He is King, all wars will cease. May His peace begin